They don't hate intelligence. That's the comfortable lie. What they hate is what intelligence exposes. Because real intelligence isn't charming. It doesn't comfort. It doesn't reassure. It doesn't exist to make people feel good about themselves. It exists to notice. And noticing is violent to illusion. The intellectual is not hated because they are superior. They are hated because they refuse to pretend. They refuse to pretend that contradictions are harmony. They refuse to pretend that consciousness is truth. They refuse to pretend that emotion is evidence. And they refuse to pretend that belonging is wisdom. And when one person refuses to pretend, everyone else suddenly becomes aware that they are pretending. That awareness hurts. It creates shame. And shame never attacks itself. It looks for a target. So it attacks the intellectual. Not through debate, not through reason, but through character assassination. Through tone policing, through social isolation, through labels, through dismissal, through mockery, through moral inversion. You are arrogant. You are cold. You are negative. You are overthinking. You are not fun. Not because the intellectual is wrong, but because they are inconvenient. They make reality heavier, and people prefer light lies to heavy truth. The intellectual doesn't ruin conversations. They reveal what conversations are built on. They reveal that most dialogue is not about understanding, it's about alignment. Not about truth, but about emotional loyalty. People don't want to know if they are wrong. They want to know if they are supported. So the intellectual becomes a traitor by default, because they are loyal to coherence, not comfort. Loyal to questions, not identities. Loyal to clarity, not tribes. And loyalty to clarity is unforgivable in a world that survives on narrative obedience. The intellectual also reminds people of something they've abandoned: their curiosity, their doubt, their capacity to think without permission. The intellectual represents the version of themselves they did not become. And humans hate mirrors more than enemies. That's why intellectuals are attacked personally instead of intellectually. Their posture is criticized, their tone is criticized, their social skills are criticized, their delivery is criticized. Anything except their content. Because attacking content requires understanding it, and understanding it risks accepting it. So society doesn't silence intellectuals with violence. It silences them with exclusion. They are tolerated only when they simplify. They are welcomed only when they entertain. They are celebrated only when they agree. Death is permitted only when it is decorative. But the moment intelligence becomes disruptive, it becomes threatening. The intellectual eventually realizes they are not misunderstood. They are understood enough to be avoided, because proximity to awareness forces self-examination. And self-examination is exhausting when your identity is built on shortcuts. So people rewrite the intellectual into something easier to hate. They turn intelligence into arrogance. They turn precision into cruelty. They turn depth into elitism. Because if intelligence is allowed to be accurate and good at the same time, mediocrity loses its protection. The intellectual begins to withdraw, not out of superiority, out of sadness. Because they see humans defending the very illusions that limit them. They see people protecting cages as if they were homes. They see emotional attachment to beliefs that were never chosen, only inherited. And there is nothing more tragic than watching someone protect what confines them. The intellectual carries awareness without relief. They see patterns, they see repetition, they see inevitability. They watch revolutions become branding. They watch suffering become content. They watch empathy become performance. And they watch morality become strategy. And slowly, something changes inside them. They drift towards nihilism, not as rebellion, as recognition. Nihilism doesn't begin with despair. It begins with clarity. It begins when you realize that meaning is assigned, not discovered. That morality shifts with convenience. That history is curated. That identity is constructed. That truth is filtered. That justice is selective. The intellectual doesn't decide nothing matters. They realize nothing matters automatically. And that distinction changes everything. Nihilism is not apathy. It is intellectual grief. It is what remains when illusions fall away. It is the quiet understanding that the universe does not care if you are kind or honest or awake. That existence continues whether you understand it or not. And for the first time, meaning becomes your responsibility. Not destinies, not God's, not society's, not history's, yours. And responsibility without illusion is heavy. So most people reject nihilism, not because it is false, but because it removes their emotional scaffolding. The intellectual does not reject it. They learn to live inside it, and that makes them even more dangerous. Because a nihilistic intellectual cannot be controlled by hope, fear, promise, or destiny. They no longer believe history is progressing towards justice. They no longer believe humanity is morally ascending. They no longer believe suffering has cosmic purpose. They believe only in awareness, choice, and consequence. They don't need meaning handed to them. They can exist without narrative, and a person who can exist without narrative cannot be owned. Nihilism doesn't make the intellectual cruel, it makes them precise. It strips away emotional fantasy, it dissolves sacred illusions, it turns morality from theatre into responsibility. But it also carries a cost, because love becomes riskier when you know it is temporary. Joy becomes softer when you know it is fragile. Hope becomes quieter when you know it is optional. And belief becomes cautious when you know it is constructed. The intellectual does not lose emotion. They lose emotional innocence. They can still love, but they love knowing it may end. They can still hope, but they hope without guarantees. They can still care, but they care without cosmic reassurance. And that makes their care more real. Not louder, but deeper. The nihilistic intellectual does not believe life is pointless. They believe life has no automatic point. And so they ask a question most people cannot bear. What am I willing to care about despite its meaninglessness? That question has no comfort, only responsibility, only freedom. And freedom terrifies people more than chains. So society returns to its stories, its heroes, its villains, its emotion, its moral theatre, and it hates the intellectual even more now, because the intellectual no longer reacts correctly. They don't cheer on cue, they don't outrage on schedule, They don't mourn. They don't celebrate without permission. They stand slightly apart from the performance. Not cold, not heartless, just aware. And awareness ruins theatre. The intellectual becomes lonely, not because they reject people, but because people reject the discomfort they represent. They begin to wonder if awareness is a defect, if clarity is a curse, if ignorance is peace. They envy ease. They envy certainty. They envy belonging. But they cannot return. Once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you question, you cannot worship. Once you understand patterns, you cannot believe in randomness the same way. Once you know, you cannot pretend. So the intellectual walks alone, not as a hero, not as a martyr, just as a witness, to a world that prefers comfort over clarity, to a society that fears responsibility more than ignorance, to a humanity that loves intellectuals only after they are dead, when they can no longer interrupt, when they can no longer correct, when they can no longer expose. Only then are they quoted, romanticized, turned into symbols instead of threats. Because living thinkers still argue back, still refuse to behave, still ask why. And why is the most dangerous word in any system built on obedience. So when you ask why intellectuals are hated, it's not because they are smarter, it's because they are awake. And awakening is contagious. And nothing frightens a comfortable world more than a mind that no longer needs permission to think. The intellectual is not hated because they destroy meaning. They are hated because they demand that meaning survive honesty. They are not hated because they are cold. They are hated because they are clear. They are not hated because they are superior. They are hated because they are free. And freedom, in a world built on stories, is the most unforgivable crime. So the intellectual does not ask to be loved. They no longer ask to belong. They only remain honest. And in that honesty, they lose illusions, they lose approval, they lose comfort. But they gain something rare: silence. Not the absence of sound, the absence of lies. And in that silence, they finally meet themselves. Not as a role, not as a label, not as a story, but as a conscious witness inside an indifferent universe. And for the first time, nothing is pretending. And somehow, that is enough. Thanks for listening.